This is a joint endeavor with Fundação Getúlio Vargas and USP, and we have a group called GIFITED, which is a group that unites people from both Fundação Getúlio Vargas and USP who are interested in philosophy of law, legal theory, and political philosophy. And it's really a great pleasure to have you here. Especially, it's amazing to have you here as a lecturer for our to start our course on legal theory. And this semester we have a course on Wittgenstein law, and in your lecture on interpretivist jurisprudence fits very well as a starting point for this course. And for me, who have been studying jurisprudence and work in this theory, it's particularly interesting reading your paper, and I'm really very much willing to hear you. So I don't want to take more of your time. We're here to listen to you, so we welcome you, and then later, so we'll leave you some time for discussion after your lecture. And I'd like also to invite everybody to next Thursday to listen to Professor Heidi Hurt. She'll be talking about philosophy of environmental law, and her talk will be about why sustain what we do not value, why value what we are not moved to sustain. So we all are invited for her lecture. So we welcome you. Thank you very much, Professor Moore.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've not been in Sao Paulo before, but I'm delighted to be here. In fact, I haven't been in Brazil before. I did lecture recently in Lisbon at the Católica University. So I guess I should learn some Portuguese, but unfortunately it's going to be in English. I am kind of the warm-up act for the Heard More duo. So if you want to hear a really good talk, come to my wife's talk on Thursday. But think of me as the warm-up band before the main show gets started. So when I corresponded with Ronaldo, he suggested a number of topics. One of them was interpretive jurisprudence, which I decided would be a good thing to talk about. It's not something that I've recently worked on. It's something like many people my age, and I've been teaching, I guess, for 50 years, did in the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. They say that scholarly work is like radium. It has a kind of half-life to it, a deterioration rate. But I'm reading my essay that I said would be the background for this lecture today. Reading it last night, I said, but still, I agree with that. So I'm quite happy to defend what I thought 20 years ago about this, when Ronald Dworkin and I were writing about it. Interpretive jurisprudence should rightly be seen as part of the larger movement called the interpretive turn in theories well beyond theories of law. In virtually every discipline in the 70s and 80s, there were people who called themselves self-consciously interpretivists. The people who had become, in my own taxonomy, very ambitious interpretivists were people who thought that all the world is a text. People like Barth used to say, or my colleague Jacques Derrida used to say, everything is an interpretation, by which he meant it's all up for grabs. Those are the very ambitious interpretivists, so that physics as well as literary criticism were interpretive disciplines. There were also a second tradition, the older tradition, the hermeneutes from the Greek word for meaning, the hermeneutes of the 19th century, like Dilthey at Basel, who were interpretivists about all of the Geisteswissenschaften, the science of the human spirit, the social sciences, the science of meaning, so that law became itself interpretive, not because of any unique features about law, but because it was part of the social sciences with history, sociology, psychoanalysis, literary criticism, theology. The Geisteswissenschaften were interpretive, and therefore law was interpretive. I called those in a 1989 article in Stanford called The Interpretive Turn. I call those all the ambitious interpretivists. Interpretive jurisprudence, particularly in the hands of Ronnie Dworkin, 1986, Law's Empire, is much more interesting than simply being an implication of those two more ambitious schemes. I'm not a fan of the more ambitious interpretive schemes. The subtitle of the Interpretive Turn article was called The Interpretive Turn, a turn for the worse, question mark. I was told when I gave that paper in Toronto the punctuation was wrong. It should have been a turn for the worse, exclamation point. Because it's about 100 pages of taking down the pretensions of Gadamer and Heidegger, etc. I did give that talk at the Heidegger seminar at Freiburg and Breisgau just 3 years ago to the holdouts for Heideggerian hermeneutics. It was politely received, although I don't think they believed a word of it. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about interpretive jurisprudence on its own merits, independent of those things. If you've read Ronald Dworkin's Law's Empire, 1986, sort of what I call his middle jurisprudence period, the early period where the two articles, Model of Rules, 1967, and the Hard Cases, 1975, both in his first book, Taking Right Seriously. The middle jurisprudence of Ronnie Dworkin was self-consciously interpretivist. You could get the impression from reading the footnotes where he cites Gadamer and Habermas and Heidegger and so forth, that it's just an implication of these much more ambitious interpretivisms. Frankly, I don't think Ronnie ever read those people. The footnotes were supplied by Bill Ewald, his graduate student at the time and a colleague of mine on the Penn Law faculty in the 90s. Bill had supplied them because he thought it made it look fashionable. Ronnie himself later on orally disavowed the footnotes. So don't think of the book or the theory as being in any sense Gadamerian, Habermasian, or any of the other hermeneutics that are of the ambitious or very ambitious styles. So here's the program I had in mind for our discussion. I have a little libretto to this opera, and maybe I'll just hand it out. I used to teach at the University of Virginia, which was Tom Jefferson's university, one of the oldest in America. When I left there, the students gave me a quill pen, which is what Jefferson used to write with, to celebrate the fact that I barely mastered writing, let alone computers. So excuse the low tech. But this will help our discussion if you want to follow in writing. As you'll see, there's about 5 things I'd like to talk about. One, which I guess would be appropriate for the, is this the first session of this class? Well, everybody has their own organizational schemes, and I'm sure Ronaldo has his own. But since I'm here, the first thing I want to do is give you the background into which interpretivist jurisprudence fit. Namely, traditional jurisprudence before anybody thought to call themselves interpretivists. In terms of the various schools, questions asked, and the answers given. That's the first thing I want to do, Roman number 1 on the outline. The second thing is then to look at the claims, both the substantive claims, the methodological claims, of what's called interpretivist jurisprudence, the best exemplar of which is Ronald Dworkin's Law's Empire, 1986. The third thing, and the main thing, the sort of center of gravity of our discussion, will then be to do a preliminary task before you assess the interpretivist claims of interpretivist jurisprudence, is to ask yourself the simple question, what do you mean by interpretation? That's a much contested concept, so we need to spend some time working through what would be a useful notion of interpretation. Once you put aside the bloated ideas that all knowledge is interpretive, Heidegger and company, or put aside even the rather bloated ideas that all knowledge in the social sciences, the Geisteswissenschaften, that's interpretive. what's the interestingly distinct notion of interpretation that makes interpretive jurisprudence an interesting question? That's what I want to spend a lot of time on, the third part of the talk. The fourth and fifth parts of the talk, I'm going to ask you to apply what we've just discussed to what you already know something about. Namely, in the fourth part of the talk is law practice, the practice of law by judges and lawyers within a legal system. Is that in any interesting sense interpreted? And then the fifth and last question, distinct from practicing law, is doing what you're doing in this class, which is theorizing about people who practice law and about the law that they practice. Legal theory. Are legal theoreticians engaged in something that can be called interpretive jurisprudence in any interesting sense of interpretation? The fulcrum of those two analyses, is law practice interpretive and is legal theory interpretive, is to work through carefully a notion of interpretation that makes some sense out of it as a distinct form of human activity, distinct from describing something, explaining something, or evaluating and recommending something. Okay, first of the 5 tasks, the background of jurisprudence. As I say, no taxonomy is neutral. I won't pretend mine is either. Ronaldo can correct me when I'm going with his own. Here's how I see it, and I think pretty close to the way Dworkin saw it when he wrote his '86 book. Everyone starts jurisprudence, seemingly, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, since about 1825, John Austin's lectures on jurisprudence at what became University College London. Everybody starts with the question of what is law? What is law is one of those what is questions that, as Hart says in chapter 1 of The Concept of Law, the famous book of 1961, one of those questions you need to play with a bit before you try to answer it. Because what is questions are notoriously fuzzy. They also invite sort of semi-profound quips. Like Eric Siegel, who taught at Yale in the literature department, wrote a famous book called Love Story, where he starts out with, what is love? And the answer to the book is, love is never having to say you're sorry. One of the dumber things ever said about love. Or Johnny Cash, the American Western singer, what is truth? And he strummed along with his guitar, and you find it's the lonely voice of youth. So you need to ask a bit, what do you want to know about what is law? So Hart says, look, what you want to know when you ask questions like this is what's the nature of the thing, including its relation to other things you think you might antecedently understand, like morality. So you want to know what law is, what its relation is to morality, what its relation is to the obligations of either citizens or judges to follow its dictates just because it's the law. Those questions of the relation to morality, of obligatoriness, whether there's a distinct notion of legal obligation different than moral obligation, all are folded into this what is law question. Now, what is law itself, since 1825, has been fractionated into a variety, actually, of different questions in traditional jurisprudence. Before the Interpretivist comes along with his Alexandrian sword, remember Alexander the Great, when he first came to Persia, was confronted with the Gordian knot, which no one could untie, and he pulled out his sword and cut it, and he said, now I can untie it. Before the Interpretivist comes along and cuts through all of the distinctions, there are 4 dominant dimensions that I want to distinguish in traditional jurisprudence, which will allow me then to say why interpretivism thinks it's different. The 4 dimensions go like this. 3 of them are on the outline. I'll mention the 4th. The first is a set of distinctions Hart introduced in his debate with Lon Fuller in 1958 in the Harvard Law Review. He said, look, if you want to talk about the nature of law, about its relation to morality, about its necessary obligatoriness, there are 3 points of intersection between law and morality that you should distinguish. At its most general level, when you're talking about law, you're talking about legal systems. You're talking about, does a society have a legal system? And you have to then have an analysis of what a legal system is before you can say, is there any law around here? That's just like an anthropologist coming to a society and asking, do they have any religious system? Do they have any water system? Do they have any kind of system at all? That's a general question about law in the sense of legal system. Distinct from that, Hart said, is asking about laws with an S. What are the standards that obligate legal actors, such as judges and lawyers who argue to judges, to take them into account as they issue verdicts in disputed cases at law? What are the things that have to be paid attention to within a legal system? That's the question of laws. Is it a set of rules with a particular source? Is it a set of principles with a particular content? But those are the kinds of questions you want to ask about laws. General standards that decide particular cases. That's the second thing you mean by law. Third thing you mean by law, Hart said, is what the lawyers call the law of the case, what Ronnie Dworkin calls singular legal propositions. Propositions that decide particular cases because they refer to particular people and particular transactions. Dworkin's example is, this contract is valid. You refer to a particular contract and attribute a legal property to it, namely validity, and what you say is indeed a legal proposition, and it decides a particular case. As the lawyers say, that's the proposition of law to which res judicata effect is attributed. So we have singular propositions of law in addition to general standards, in addition to legal systems. Now, as Hart said, those three things are interrelated. You can't have laws without having a legal system, and you rather hope singular propositions of law bear some intimate relationship to the meaning of general laws. So all three of those things have a relation, but three distinct points of contact. And as Hart said, if you care about morality being part of the nature of law, a lot more plausible to think it's part of the nature of singular propositions of law than it is about the nature of a legal system or even about the nature of laws themselves. So anyway, that's the first set of distinctions. When you're talking about law, you can be talking about legal system, general standards, or singular propositions that decide cases. The second set of distinctions has to do with what Austin distinguished as general, or some people call it external jurisprudence, and what's usually called particular, or some people call it internal jurisprudence. Jurisprudence done from the point of view prescinded from any particular legal system. It's the view that Hart wrote his book, The Concept of Law, from. Where would you find law? What would you have to find law? Suppose we find a bunch of Martians, and we come upon our society and we want to know if they have a legal system. What would be the criteria by virtue of which you decided whether there's any law on Mars? That would be an external question, because you're not asking it from the point of view of the English legal system, you're not asking it from the point of view of the Martian legal system, you're asking about whether law anywhere and always has these characteristics. As opposed to what? As opposed to particular jurisprudence. What is the law of Brazil? Is a distinct question from when is there law in Brazil. What are the laws that obligate, in terms of their general standards, obligate Brazilian lawyers and judges? That's within a legal system. It's what Ronnie Dworkin self-consciously practices. Within a legal system, what is the laws that bind the actors within that legal system? There will, of course, be a relation between the two again, but again, it will be somewhat of a different enterprise. The laws of Brazil will share the characteristics of a legal system, if there's a legal system here, which there is, but it will also have its own idiosyncratic features. So there's particular jurisprudence, general jurisprudence. Hart's a good instance of general, Dworkin's a good instance of particular. Third distinction. There's a distinction incipient in Hart's concept of law, but made very explicit by people like Jared Postma at North Carolina and others. The distinction between doing descriptive jurisprudence and doing normative jurisprudence. You can describe law the way Aquinas does in the Summa. You can seek its essence if you think law has a nature, in which event you look to the thing law and try to describe what you believe to be its essential properties. You can do what Hart did and Raz in his book, The Concept of Legal System. You can try to describe the concept of law that is a nominal kind, not a natural kind, something that is constituted by the concept we have of it. You can do the concept of law as a description, but in any case, you're describing. But you could also be recommending doing something different. You could be evaluating the concept we have and recommending we have a different one. You could be doing it evaluative. You could be doing normative jurisprudence. This is the law we ought to have. This is the concept of law we ought to employ. Hart in the concept of law distinguishes two kinds of normative jurisprudence. You could do so for reasons of morality. You could think that a certain concept of law leads to better notions of civil disobedience, his example. You could do it on moral grounds. Or you could do it on grounds of theory, construction, and social science. It could be you need a concept of law that's different than the one we currently employ because social science will work better in its explanations with this altered concept. In any event, there's this enterprise usually distinguished as normative jurisprudence. What's the law or the concept of law we ought to employ, as opposed to the ones we actually do employ. The third distinction. The fourth distinction is this one. Within an internal view about legal systems, you can prescind from any legal role within the system and simply ask, in general, what's the law within that legal system? Or you can think that the law differs in either its obligatory force or maybe even its content between different roles. That the role of a legislator is different than the role of a judge is different yet again from the role of a citizen vis-a-vis the laws of their society. You could think, as Ronnie Dworkin does, that laws obligate judges in their role of judges necessarily. That they do so of citizens is a much more contentious matter. And legislators, of course, are free to change the law so they're not obligated by the law in their legislative function the way judges are. So you have a role-specific theory. If you're going to have a role-specific theory, then you'll probably do what Dworkin does, which is make it a judge-centered theory. Dworkin explicitly sets his sights throughout both his early and his middle and his later jurisprudence on the law in the sense of the role of a judge being obligated by that standard. Hart always called that the American, meaning US, the US obsession with judicial behavior. But law, in this sense, is particularly focused on what judges are obligated by. So you have four distinctions. Distinctions about the generality of law, legal system laws, singular propositions. Distinctions about general legal systems, particular legal system. Distinctions between normative, descriptive jurisprudence. And distinctions about role-specific or non-role-specific views of law. If you multiply those out, you get something like, 64 different questions, permutations of the question, what is law? What's nice about jurisprudence is that really there are only three answers to all those questions in the way people group their theories. Namely, there's the old debate between natural lawyers, legal positivists, that's two positions. And then there's what I call the gadfly position, the skeptics who say it pox on both your houses and the law is nothing but power non-nakedly asserted so as to disguise its true nature. The legal skeptics. That's roughly the three that are in Dworkin's book, but he's got a bit of a substitution. I'll do my own taxonomy. So, what does natural lawyers believe? Well, in the Catholic tradition, Aquinas to Finis to Robbie George at Princeton today, in the Catholic tradition, it's the, as Aquinas says, fact that law, to be law, has to bind the conscience. And if it binds the conscience, Aquinas, the only thing that can bind the conscience is morality. There has to be an intimate relation between the law, the human law of any society, and the divine or natural law that religion, or if you're not religion, secular reality dictates as the right moral answer. There's the old natural law view, probably the oldest of legal views. There's secondly, and notice natural lawyers tend to be natural lawyers right through the variables that I so carefully distinguished. They're natural lawyers about being law or legal systems anywhere, but also in particular societies. They're natural lawyers about the law we have and about the law we ought to have. The same is true for legal positivists. Across the board, their answer about the nature of law is different. Law, they want to say, is law because of its source. It's the kind of thing that has authority for us because some authoritative source has issued it. Aquinas' old example in the Summa was, of course, God's law, divine law. Divine law, he said, was authoritative to us for two reasons. One, God was omnipotent, and two, God was omniscient. I don't think we think legislatures are either, but you get the flavor. God was omnipotent because, as Aquinas says, he made true by his command what was morally right. God was omniscient because the other part of morality existed antecedent to God's command, but God could advise you about it because being omniscient at all, he made no mistakes. In which event God was both what Raz would call a practical and a theoretical authority. In which event you had some source. It's not that God gets it right that makes it authoritative. It's that God said it. Historical fact. The same about legislatures. So law is law not because the content has some relation to morality, rather because the law, as Dworkin used to say, has a certain pedigree, or as Raz would say, has a certain source, or as Hart would say, has its origins in a social fact about the rule of recognition. Namely, there's a fact of institutional history that tells you what the law of any society is, and that's a social fact, not a moral judgment. Legal positivism comes in many, many flavors. There's the old Austin Bentham view that Hart himself repudiated, that law is nothing more than coercive orders of the sovereign, and that legal obligation is nothing more than the sanctions that sovereign attaches. That's a very Pickwickian notion of obligation. There's the softer positivism of Hart himself. Law is the set of rules that are obeyed by the citizens and that are adopted as having an internal attitude by the officials who apply them to those citizens, namely judges. There's Kelson's kind of positivism, and there's Raz's. There's a lot of variations. They all share the view that law is law because of its source, not because of its content. And then there are the gadflies, the people who think that law actually isn't anything at all, at least it doesn't live up to its pretense. What you think of as law as some neutral thing in its source, or some good thing in its content, natural law, legal positivism, it has neither of those attributes. It is simply a disguised form of power decided on an evaluative basis, case to case. Now, we've had some famous generations of skeptics in America, and you have actually in Brazil too. In the 20s and 30s, despite some antecedents in Holmes, in the 20s and 30s, and even into the 40s, the American legal realists like Felix Cohen, Carl Llewellyn, Max Reid, had the view that law was itself, as Llewellyn said in the Bramble Bush, a pretty plaything. It has a pretense to actually a neutrality and a decisiveness that it doesn't possess. There's a political point of view, and there's an evaluation every time it's applied. So law, in what it's supposed to be at least, doesn't really exist, the skeptical view. The second generation in America, and in Germany as well, is called the critical legal studies movement of the 70s and 80s. I don't think the Brazilian theorist Roberto Unger should be seen as a card-carrying member of critical legal studies. He was more their idol and more their inspiration. But nonetheless, very much an inspiration of critical legal studies in his first book, Knowledge and Politics, in 1975. Critical legal studies, the legal realist view, law is simply power that's asserted with a new twist. Law, as Duncan Kennedy, Mark Kelman, and other critical legal theorists used to say, is rent by the internal contradictions, deep contradictions within the law, from which, of course, anything follows. It has no determinacy, but for a rather different reason than the legal realists thought so. It had no determinacy, not because there was too little, because there was too much. It contradicted itself. Anything follows from a contradiction. There's still some critical legal types in America and elsewhere around the world. Now, it's no accident traditional jurisprudence has these three schools: natural law, legal positivism, legal skepticism. That Dworkin calls the skeptics pragmatists, but he means the same folks. No accident, because if you look at basic ontology about anything, there's usually just three positions in metaphysics to be distinguished. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the existence of real numbers as Platonic entities in mathematics, whether you're talking about moral rights or moral qualities, like goodness, whether you're talking about theoretical entities in science, there's really only three positions metaphysically. There's what's called philosophical realism. It has nothing to do with legal realism. Philosophical realism, which consists of two assertions. The entities in question exist, the existential premise, and the entities in question existence does not depend upon mind or human convention, usually called the mind independence criterion. So if you're a moral realist, like I am, or Aquinas, or others about objectivists in ethics, you'll think that moral qualities like goodness and rightness, moral entities like rights and duties, exist, i.e. propositions about them, some of them at least, are true, and their existence doesn't depend on what anyone thinks or desires. It's mind independent. That's the realist position. The conventionalist position asserts the first proposition, moral entities exist, but denies the second. They're not mind or convention independent. They exist only as the nominal kinds created by human convention or human thought. Conventionalism, which is what Dworkin and I both called it. The third position denies the first proposition and so doesn't get to the second. The things don't really exist, skepticism. So it's no accident that in jurisprudence we've recapitulated the debate that you can find. Say in Hartree-Field's book about real numbers in mathematics, or in contemporary physics about the reality of quarks, or about the notion of meaning in social science. There are three positions about it. It exists and it's mind independent, it exists and it's not mind independent, and it doesn't exist at all. Three positions in jurisprudence as well. We are, I think, followers, not inventors of this taxonomy. So that's the background into which interpretivist jurisprudence starts. As I say, Ronaldo will undoubtedly have his own views as to how you taxonomize 150 years of jurisprudence. So interpretivists, second item on my outline. Interpretivists, they're like all of us. They want to do something new. Nobody likes their views to be put inside of a school so that everybody thinks you know what you think because they know what the school thinks in which they placed you. One way to avoid being schooled in that sense, categorized, is to say, I've got a whole new school. It's my school. That's the ambition of the interpretivist in jurisprudence. The interpretivist eschews the answers and the methods of traditional jurisprudence, be they the natural lawyer, the legal positivist, or the skeptic. And says, I have a fourth way of doing jurisprudence, which we'll call interpretivist. That was not the ambition of early Dworkin, but it is the ambition of middle Dworkin in the Law's Empire, so he will be my exemplar. There are certainly other interpretivists in jurisprudence, but his is the most worked out and the most famous. So what does Dworkin think? If you look at the outline under Roman 2, he thinks, this is a fourth kind of jurisprudence. There's natural law, legal positivism, legal skepticism, and then there's me. So he sounds like Donald Trump. Then there's me. We all have that much of a Trumpian ambition for ourselves. And then there's more. He's off on his own. I don't pretend to have a school. I'm happy to be a natural law tech. But Dworkin wants his own school. So there's a fourth kind of jurisprudence, interpretive jurisprudence. It has its own method. It says it's not describing the law that we have. It's not prescribing, recommending, evaluating the law we should have. It's an indivisible blend of description and evaluation that he calls interpretation. Interpretation in Dworkin's hands is an indivisible blend that is both descriptive and normative at the same time, but you can't divide out the elements. That's the methodological claim about interpretism. It transcends the distinction. It also repudiates the distinction that I started with from Hart and Austin between external or general jurisprudence and internal or particular jurisprudence. Dworkin and I and others gave a birthday party for Hart in Jerusalem in 1984. It was for his 80th birthday, which was in 87, which is when the volume was published, but we anticipated Oxford would take 3 years to get it out. So we had the birthday party in 84. Dworkin gave an early version of his book, and he gave this argument, namely that Hart's kind of jurisprudence was impossible. Namely, external jurisprudence was an impossibility because you could never get external to your own practices. However much Hart thought he was talking about law on Mars and law anywhere, he was really just talking about law within the English or Anglo-American legal system. Hart and I both responded to what an extraordinarily imperialist, Hart's word, imperialist claim that was. rather than like Chairman Mao letting 100 flowers bloom, you do your thing, I do my thing. This is to say your thing isn't possible to do. A rather extraordinary claim to which we said, so Ronnie, what's the argument for that? Why would you think external jurisprudence isn't possible? So everybody has to be doing what you're doing, which is internal jurisprudence. So however much Hart had universalist aspirations, he was really interpreting the Anglo-American legal system. Well, there are a number of sort of antecedents to that view. I mean, there's, ahead of me at the University of Illinois Philosophy Department years ago was Peter Winch. As I look around this room, I don't think anyone's old enough to remember. Peter Winch wrote a book called The Idea of Social Science, which is what happened to him when he read too much Wittgenstein for his own good in the 1950s. Many of us, when that book came out, dubbed it the very idea of social science, because it's quite critical of social science being the science it pretends to be. Anyway, in the book, Winch takes the following position: that if you're an anthropologist studying religious practices of another society, you can only understand, and usually you shout understand, and usually you put it in German, verstehen. You can only verstehen. You understand it only if you join the natives in the practice. There is no external understanding that's possible unless you vicariously experience the practice from the inside. So it becomes a kind of epistemic thesis. You can't stand outside a practice, whether it's religion or law, and understand the practice. You have to go inside. That would be one possible basis for the claim. Extraordinarily counterintuitive, right? However much you think you are aided as an anthropologist by going native, as they say, namely joining the natives you're studying in the practices that you're studying, nonetheless, you can stand outside and be a non-committal, what Raz calls the non-committal external view. You understand it because you see the content of it and what it means for them, but that doesn't mean you join them in the evaluation. That surely is possible, and obviously so. So what else could Dworkin have been thinking with this imperialist claim? Well, there's the old argument of Carnap, that you can't stand outside of all human practice to evaluate human practice. That might be right. Where do the skeptics, Plato asks Glaucon in the Republic, where do the skeptics stand when they try to stand external to all thought to criticize our modes of thought? By virtue of what thought are they thinking, if it's not the modes of thought that they're criticizing? If you're talking about all thought, Dworkin's move is rather plausible. You can't stand outside of all thought. It doesn't make any sense. There is no view from nowhere. You have to have a view from somewhere. You have to be within a system of thought. But if you're talking about something discrete, like a legal system, of course you can stand outside of it. You can stand outside of it from the general point of view, say, of social science. So that it seems incredible, but nonetheless a dominant view of interpretivism, that you can't do external jurisprudence, you can only do particular, the third of its claims. The fourth of its claims I don't have on the outline, but it's very explicit. As Dworkin says, if you're going to do internal jurisprudence, which he says you must do, then you should do it from the point of the judge. So the judge is the mirror for the theory to find out what the law is in a legal system, because it's judges. And lawyers, of course, are just little judges when they argue to judges. You have to pretend to be a judge to argue to a judge. Lawyers and judges are the mirror you hold up to see what the law is of any society, because they're the ones whose obligations are governed by whatever it is that's law. So he says, write the book, in fact, write everything he ever wrote in jurisprudence, from the point of view of the judge. It's a role-specific theory, and the role that is specific to is that of a judge. So those are the interpretivists' claims. I separate them in parts 4 and 5 of my talk between claiming law practice is interpretive and legal theory is interpretive. I want to examine those two separately, as Dworkin does not, because I think those are separate questions. Those will be the last two things. Before we get to them, however, we need to do something that Dworkin tries to do, but I don't think, do something that I would like to do myself, leaving aside what he does. Namely, what's the useful notion of interpretation by virtue of which you either sustain or refute these interpretive claims? Now, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I put aside, as uninteresting even in Dworkin's own terms, making interpretive jurisprudence just be an instance of very ambitious Heideggerian hermeneutics, or making it even an instance of the less ambitious but still pretty ambitious interpretivism of the Geisteswissenschaften tradition of Delta. It's much more interesting than that. See interpretation as a human activity we sometimes have reason to do that is prima facie distinct, as Dworkin says, from describing, from explaining, from evaluating. And the trick is to figure out what that activity is. That's the burden of the third part of the outline that I just handed out. What's the notion? I call it modest interpretivism, because it's modest in comparison to all the theorists who made the interpretive turn in all the disciplines in which they made it in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It says interpretation is a human activity. Let's ask what's distinctive about it without thinking it has to apply very broadly to very many things. Maybe to jurisprudence, maybe to a few other things. I think the first temptation is to say, well, okay, interpretation. That's to find the meaning of something. If you look at Annette Barnes' book on interpretation, that's where she starts. It's natural enough. Start with, it's to find the meaning, but again you say, okay, what has meaning? Well, texts have meaning. Well, what's a text? Here you cannot rely on ordinary language, whether it's Portuguese, which I'm sure is the same as English. The usage of the words interpretation, meaning, and text are like the usage of a lot of other words. I wrote this 600-page book on causation recently. You can't rely on what people ordinarily say about causation. It's just a mess. You don't have a chance. You can't rely on what people say about meaning, interpretation, or text either. Ordinary speech won't help you. People say things like, clouds mean rain. They only mean that clouds are evidence that it's going to rain. They say things like, rain means that there were clouds. Well, that means that because it rained, there must have been clouds, because that's where the rain comes from. That's only to assert a causal connection between natural phenomena. Clouds cause rain. If you know the effect, you can infer the cause. If you know the cause, you can infer the effect. That's an uninteresting sense of meaning. When geologists say things like, the rocks of the earth form the text that it is our business to interpret. I used to be a geology major for about 2 months. That doesn't help us either. Now, if God laid down those sedimentary rocks to tell us something, that would be a text. But the natural geologic processes that make the rocks be evidence of how they were formed, igneous rocks, and evidence of what's going to happen next is akin just to assert natural causal connections. So in a famous article, one of my first teachers in the philosophy of language, Paul Grice at Berkeley, Philosophical Review 1957, called Meaning, says, look, you've got to put aside what he called meaning sub n, meaning natural. That's just everything. Everything with causal connections has meaning. Since everything we know about has causal connections, or we wouldn't know about it, that means everything has meaning. That's hopeless. So we can't use natural meaning. Grice says you have to distinguish non-natural meaning. The meaning that is imparted to phenomena by something that has intentionality to it. So we need some notion of non-natural meaning. The first thing that most people think of when they see this move is to go to what I call in the outline the communicative model of interpretation. Namely, the model for when we interpret is what you're doing right now. I'm speaking, you're listening. Here's how this is supposed to work. I have two kinds of intentions. I mean something by what I say, what Austin would have called my locutionary intention. I have a semantic intention, that's what I mean. I mean to achieve something by saying it, what Austin would have called my perlocutionary intention. I mean for you to understand it and even believe it. I mean to convince you. So I have two sets of intentions, semantic intentions and perlocutionary intentions when I speak. At the end of the process, I want you to have beliefs, the kind that J.L. Austin used to call uptake. I want you to have an understanding of my semantic intentions. It doesn't mean you have to believe what I intend. It means you have to believe that I intend you to know this. You have to figure out what I mean. So the object of your belief should match the object of my semantic intentions, not that you believe, but you believe that I intended. Okay? How do I achieve that? Through two sets of conventions. Every language has both semantic and pragmatic conventions. I choose the words that I choose because they have a type meaning, no matter the context of utterance. They have a certain range of meanings. And given syntax of natural languages, when you combine those word meanings, the sentences have a meaning. So that there's a type meaning that semantics studies in terms of the truth conditions of the sentences and the words within them. And then there's what Grice studied so detailed in his famous lectures at Harvard. There's the pragmatics of appropriate utterance, the conventions that determine what's pragmatic to say, which refines the semantic meanings into something much more determinate, what Grice used to call the utterance meaning. The meaning of the type of sentence uttered on this occasion of its utterance. What contemporary linguists like Scott Soames at USC, who's very good at this stuff, doesn't call utterance meaning, but calls the meaning as uttered. Same thing. Okay, so two sets of conventions. Now, interpretation for communication is for you to figure out what I intend. That's what succeeds. And there's nothing wrong with that as a start about thinking about interpretation. To find the meaning of my utterance is to find what I meant by it, authorial intention. But notice that's much too parochial to deal with all ways in which we usefully talk about interpretation. It's too parochial because we talk about literary criticism, for example. There is a school, E.D. Hirsch's books on literary criticism, that says you should be looking for what the author meant. What did he intend to communicate to you with his novel or his play? I think most literary critics scorn that as an insufficiently imaginative use of art. That literary criticism and art criticism in general is not to recapture artistic intention. It is to interpret in some looser, freer, more interesting sense. And that seems to make sense to an entire discipline. Take dream interpretation. It's my first venture into interpretation. 1960s, my first philosophy of science lecture on der Dramaturgie, the meaning of dreams, Freud. Dream interpretation. Freud said the manifest content of a dream